Welcome to Chapter 5, The Chromosomal Basis of Mendelism. So this is just an outline of the chapter sections that we'll be talking about. First we'll talk about chromosomes, and then we'll talk about the chromosome theory of heredity. We'll move on to sex-linked genes and the sex chromosomes and how they determine the gender or the sex of the individual. And then we'll talk about a special situation of something called dosage compensation of X-linked genes. And each of these sections is going to be a different video. So our first video we'll just focus on chromosomes. This will be a short introduction into chromosomes. Now, we've been talking a lot about genes and how they determine traits or the phenotype of the organism. But now let's just take a little step backwards and think about, well, how do those genes travel from parent to offspring? What is the vehicle, if you will, that carries the genes? Well, that vehicle, what we can think of it like a vehicle, is the chromosomes. Now, chromosomes are composed of DNA. And the DNA is what carries the information. It contains regions of information that we call genes, plus these packaging proteins. So you can picture chromosome kind of like a spool of thread, where the thread is the DNA and the spool is the packaging proteins. And this special packaging allows the DNA to fit inside the cell. So every living species has different chromosomes, and the chromosomes that each species has is characteristic to that species. Not only the chromosomes themselves and the information on the chromosomes, but also the number of chromosomes. And that total number and size of the chromosomes or the genome is not at all related to the complexity of the species or the size of the species. Now, again, we have different numbers of chromosomes depending upon the species. For humans, that number is 22 autosomes and 1 sex chromosome. We actually have a pair of each of those, so we actually have 23 pairs, or 46 chromosomes altogether, and we'll get back to that a little bit in a little while. Now, we're able to visualize the chromosomes in the cell, and when we're talking about eukaryotic cells, we can see them obviously in the nucleus. So we can see them by staining the nucleus and by seeing essentially these thread-like structures. And we really can only see the chromosomes during cell division when they're tightly packed for easy segregation into daughter cells. During interphase, they're very loosely coiled. We refer to that as chromatin, and they're very thin, very difficult to see. But during cell division, when we stain them with a specific nuclear dye, a dye that stains objects in the nucleus, we see different regions that stain differently, and we refer to these as basically a banding pattern. The lightly stained regions are called the euchromatin, and these regions typically contain genes that are on or are expressed, whereas the heterochromatin will stain more darkly, and these are the unexpressed genes, or the genes that are essentially turned off. Now, most somatic cells, now a somatic cell is essentially any cell other than the gamete. So any cell other than the egg or the sperm is going to be known as somatic cell. Most somatic cells have 2 copies of each chromosome, and we refer to that as diploid, or as also designated as 2N. So for humans, as I mentioned, the diploid number will be 46 because we have 2 sets of each chromosome, or a pair of each chromosome, as I mentioned previously. Now, as I mentioned, the gametes, which are not somatic cells, they only have 1 copy of each chromosome, so we call them haploid, and we designate that as N. Now, it's important for gametes to be haploid because upon fertilization, with the fusion of egg and sperm, we can restore that diploid number. Now, there are some species, most notably plants, that have more than 2 sets of chromosomes per cell. In some cases, there are actually 4 sets per cell, and this is known as tetraploid, or 4N. Now, as I mentioned, we have autosomes and chromosomes. Now, let's look at this a little more closely. Now, when we look at males and females of the same species, we see that there are chromosomes that they have in common. We call these the autosomes. But what we also see is that the sex chromosomes will vary between males and females, and also between species. There are different species have different ways of determining the sex or the gender in terms of sex chromosomes, and we'll get back to that a little bit later on in the presentation. Now, for example, humans females, as you probably already know, are XX, which means that they contain 2 X chromosomes as their sex chromosomes, whereas the males contain the sex chromosomes X and Y. So if you look here, we can see that in parents, okay, the female parent has 2 X chromosomes, the male has an X and a Y. And what's going to happen is the female is always going to pass an X chromosome onto all of her children, both the sons and the daughters, because it's all she has to pass on. The male is going to pass on either an X or a Y. When he passes on the X, you get 2 X's, end up with a daughter. When you pass on a Y, you end up with an X and Y, you end up with a son. And so it's the male that determines the gender of the offspring. Now the DNA sequences, and therefore the genes on the X and Y chromosomes, are different. The exception to this rule is these terminal regions. Okay, these regions in the chromosome, essentially right at the tips here. Those are the same between males and between X and Y chromosomes. Now, in other animals, such as some insects, including grasshoppers, the females have 2 X chromosomes, similar to humans, but the males only have 1 X chromosome and no other sex chromosome. So here, the female, again, is going to pass on an X chromosome to all of her offspring, because that's all she has to give. And the male will either pass on an X chromosome or nothing in terms of sex chromosomes. So if he passes on an X, you end up with a female. If he does not pass on any sex chromosome, we end up with a male. And again, we see that the male is going to determine the gender of the offspring. Now, this concludes part 1 of chapter 5. Please join me again as we start part 2, the chromosome theory of heredity.